So welcome to our final discussion on philosophy in Iran, which today is a bit of a summing up, taking stock of what we've been discussing for the last few weeks, and trying to draw upon the expertise and the experiences of the others who were in the conversation with us. So what we'll do in today's session is I'll just make a few comments about the themes which I thought came up during our conversations, perhaps some areas of philosophy which we did not have a chance to discuss. I will then pass to my colleague Mohsen in Tehran, who will try to do the same, and then we'll open it up and hopefully we can have a fruitful conversation about what we can say, under the rubric that I'd set of what is philosophy in Iran. So in terms of the themes which came up, which I thought were interesting, the first one, which is the really obvious one, is that philosophy has a very significant political context. It had a political context before 1979, of course, as well, but especially since 79, it has an important context because of the way in which the revolution brought about perhaps not just a change in socioeconomic circumstances, but also had the claims to making a very important intellectual impact, both in Iran and beyond. So within that kind of intellectual impact and the challenge to the other, philosophy played a role, whether that was the instrumentalization of Islamic philosophy, which we talked about a bit, as well as the use of other traditions and areas of philosophy, whether it was at some time the continental tradition, especially with the Heideggerians and the circle around Ahmed Fardid, or whether it was increasingly those who were embracing the analytic tradition in the same kind of vein of finding ways in which one could deal with the intellectual challenges. So that was the first point, was the political context is very important. Related to that, I think, is this idea and this impression, certainly that I've had since the 1990s, perhaps because of the political context, is that the way in which people read philosophy, consume philosophy, discuss philosophy, especially outside of the universities, in the magazines which proliferated in the 1990s, like Kian we discussed, and in many other kinds of fora, increasingly on the media, was the idea that philosophy had to be of some social relevance. So it had to speak to the sorts of issues that people within the society had. And particularly in the period which, in the 1990s, late 90s, this is often called the period of reform, or sometimes it's called the post-revolutionary period. But it's a period in which there's a lot of kind of intellectual foment. There's an increasing kind of opening out of new types of pluralities of ways of looking at the world. And so within that, philosophy had an important role to play. And that's where you get the emergence of, for example, some of the ways in which philosophy of religion was considered with respect to epistemic pressure, religious pluralism, thinking through issues around revelation and prophecy, but also increasingly, as we discussed with Dr. Zahra Muballigh, issues around feminism and women's rights and place, and a critique of perhaps rather binary ways of looking at the world and ways of looking at philosophy. And the third kind of main point I would the third point I'd make is about institutional constraints. So we discussed this quite a lot, that in formally in academic terms, in most places, philosophy is not very old. It has a history going back usually to the 1990s in most universities settings, even into the late 90s. You have, of course, other kinds of institutions. We discussed IPM, which is later than that. Anjuman Hikmat, of course, in Tehran has been going for longer, but it's had periods, as we all know, of relative inactivity. Sometimes inactivity was more on the publication side than the teaching and research, and sometimes it's been inactivity on the teaching and research side more than the publication side. But the institution constraints also related to, you know, the job market, what sort of jobs there are, who gets appointed to these philosophy jobs, particularly at the big universities. Is there a strong bias towards continental or analytic and so forth? And the sorts of requirements that certain departments had. So we talked about how at Sharif, a lot of the requirements about philosophy arose out of the need of a science and technology university to engage with philosophy of science in particular, and especially issues around the ethics of practice and the social context, which was significant. And that's the third general point theme I want to make. The final one I want to make is about the distinction, which I've already indicated, between formal academic philosophy in universities and this wider market for philosophy, whether it's through translations of books and writings, in journals, in semi-academic journals, but even newspapers. I was just reading yesterday a piece which was published fairly recently on Carl Schmitt in the newspaper, and also the proliferation of these different cultural institutions who also do a bit of teaching and run classes and courses outside of the university context, even if at times the people who are taking those courses are very much from the university setting. And that's an interesting phenomenon. I think we can find some comparisons for that in other parts of the Middle East and South Asia, etc., where there is, you know, a relatively large appetite and market for philosophy outside of the formal academic settings of a university. There was one final theme which I wanted just to mention, but we'll come back to it because I think it's really important. And this was this wider issue of to what extent doing philosophy constitutes a critique, and constitutes a critique not just of the way in which philosophy often is done in academic settings, but also a critique of the wider society in which philosophy is practiced. And I'd like to come back to this because I'm aware that of one very interesting debate which happened amongst specialists of Chinese philosophy around 15 years ago, where there was a lot of sort of back and forth on what philosophy was and whether there was such a thing as Chinese philosophy, and if you were going to come up with a universalizable definition of philosophy, then one of the suggestions was critique and speaking truth to power would have to be one of the essential elements of doing philosophy. So I'm just going to place that out. Now, just to very briefly, just to flag some of the areas of philosophy which I think we didn't cover. So as I mentioned, we didn't really cover political theology or political philosophy in any depth, although we did mention Carl Schmitt a couple of times. I'd also be interested if anyone wants to discuss whether there is an interest or appetite for Italian philosophy, what Roberto Esposito has called Italian philosophy in Iran. Another really obvious and huge area which we have not discussed at all is Marxism. So whether this is actually going back and reading the works of Marx himself and the impact that has, as well as later what is sometimes called cultural Marxism through the works of people like Althusser and especially Gramsci. So that's another area we didn't discuss. Related to that is we touched upon it a couple of times, but we didn't really discuss post-colonialism and critical theory in that way. We discussed very briefly intersectionality, but we didn't look at this wider kind of set of critiques of the way in which philosophy is done, and certain master narratives of philosophy are critiqued. Another area, of course, is aesthetics. I know there are quite a lot of I know at least one person who writes extensively on aesthetics in Tehran, but it would be something which would be of interest because it would also relate to our first conversation with Sayemeh Sami, where she was talking about her recent interest in the intersection between philosophy and literature. And then the final sort of area which I thought would be worth mentioning, although we could say that we did cover it when we were talking about analytic, is logic and philosophy of language. That certainly for the analytic tradition, that's a very important element of philosophy, but we didn't really cover that. One final area I could actually mention from my perspective, being in Exeter, well, I'm not in Exeter, I'm in London, but being institutionally in Exeter, is that the philosophers in Exeter, one of the big things they do is philosophy of biology and transhumanism and things like that. Now, you could argue that's very much a branch of philosophy of science, but it would be interesting, particularly on this issue of transhumanism, if there is discussion and debate going on within an Iranian context, because transhumanism is not just about, the fundamental question about where does the human begin and end, but it has very deep and significant theological implications as well. At what point does one remain human after all sort of changes which might happen, and if one is no longer human, then what about the kind of theological imperatives that we often discuss? So those are my kind of starter questions and suggestions, and let me pass over to Mohsen then.
Thank you, Sajjad. It was very fruitful and useful, your comments and notes and points. I will try to do the same as short as I can. I will try to abridge it so that we can open it up and have more discussions. I won't enter into the details of discussions. I just want to sum up in terms of the topics we've already discussed and the problems we could have discussed and we didn't. I think we divided the conversations as all people know by the different subfields of philosophy in Iran, and talked about Islamic philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, continental philosophy, analytic philosophy, feminist philosophy, and ethics. And I think it was a very useful plan. But still, I think we missed some points here. First of all, we missed some other subfields, as you mentioned, Sajjad. Some examples might be, as you mentioned, logic and aesthetics, not to mention some other fields which are more related to other areas like legal philosophy or philosophy of social sciences or philosophy of education. And for instance, the latter case, that is philosophy of education, is a very interesting topic, especially because it is by and large independent of the mainstream of philosophy in Iran. And it has to be studied what is the case, what is the reasons of this phenomenon. But more importantly, I think we missed some broader issues which is not confined to a specific field in philosophy. For instance, except a very short part in convo with Sayyid Nasir Musaviyan, we didn't address educational policies and the curricula of philosophy in higher education. Or, for example, besides, we haven't been able to examine what is going on concerning the teaching and the research and philosophical stuff in other departments, including especially sociology and anthropology, literature and literary studies, and so on and so forth, where some of especially Western philosophical schools and ideas are read very greatly read. These were just a couple of examples, and everyone would be able to add to this list of missed issues. Anyhow, there were some themes common in almost all sessions. First, we discussed in almost every session the academic, as you mentioned also, Sajjad, academic, social, and political context of development of different areas of philosophy in Iran. But the discussions were mostly confined to the context which are related to the post-revolutionary Iran. Also, as you mentioned. Still, I think the development of philosophy in the Iranian academy has a broader history. Whether speaking of Western philosophy or Islamic philosophy, major institutions has been established before revolution. Both departments of philosophy, for example, both departments of philosophy, Islamic and Western philosophy, I mean, in the University of Tehran has been established much earlier than revolution. This is also the case to some extent for the Iranian Research Institute of Philosophy, which was then called Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy. It might be in one sense more complicated to speak about the social and political context of the development of philosophy in pre-revolutionary Iran, but it also sounds an intriguing problem to cope with. Perhaps we should understand this problem within the wider context of encountering modernity in contemporary Iran, an aspect of which is modern philosophical thought. We also discussed the status of philosophy outside of the academy, including private institutions and houses. However, as I mentioned, we may also be able to explore the state of philosophy in other fields and their interactions with philosophy departments. There are some areas in which very many philosophical stuff are read there. As I mentioned, departments of sociology and anthropology and literary studies and literature and so on and so forth. Another theme was what I can call the problem of globalization and the relation between what is going on in philosophy in Iran and what is going on worldwide. We discussed it shorter than other topics, but we had some discussions on it. It seems to me that we can talk about this more than we did in the convos. My impression is that there are a growing number of philosophy students and scholars who want to be more integrated to the global academy, whether by studying abroad or by publishing in internationally respected journals or publishers and so forth. But one can ask how this phenomenon will have influence on the state of philosophy in Iran. For example, how this will change the focuses of studies, or does it result in more tensions between rival ideologies in Iran or not, or questions like that. It would be very interesting to think more about these kind of problems. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to include all of our about 10-hour discussions in a few minutes, but this was but a review of a few topics which we addressed, and some other topics which we can think of as per the questions. I think we may be able to open it up to have more fruitful discussions. I just wanted to mention these kind of discussions we had and the discussions we can have further.
Yes, so I guess at this point we should really open it up and invite any comments or suggestions or questions that anyone has.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So let me turn on my video. Okay, so you can see. Okay. So again, like, thank you, Sajjad and Mohsen, for this great series of conversation. One actually area that I think you mentioned in passé that we missed here, and I would love to know more about, is Islamic philosophy as it is done in its traditional setting in the seminaries. Because it seems that it's still the main way of doing it has not changed, like in the past 500, 600, 700 years. It's very text oriented, which is not necessarily bad, as opposed to like in university. Like when I was doing my master's in Iran, we had like courses in Kant and Hegel, and we didn't even read a single line, or we didn't at least have to read from Kant and Hegel. It was a lot of history of philosophy through secondhand literature. So I would love to know if you had like any information about like this way of doing philosophy in the seminaries. And here I want to actually draw a kind of comparison, which might seem a bit odd, but I think it is worthy. When I look at Iran and Islamic philosophy as it is done in its traditional seminary context, I don't know, but I do not see that much thing going on. It seems that, there is they got stuck in the commentary tradition without like producing anything new that can, address the the issues that we encountered with like after modernity and things like that. The comparison that I want to draw is this. A friend of mine actually is a professor of philosophy in China. And besides departments of philosophy in which Marxism is huge, they also have departments for Marxism. And a lot of people actually are doing Marxist philosophy in China. And my friend told me that actually a lot of people who want to grow fast politically in the party come to the university to do Marxist philosophy and then go back to their work in the Communist Party. And it seems that nothing really interesting about Marx has been produced in all these huge institutions that are, dedicated to Marxism in China, which looks odd. A lot of, manpower and women power is going into that. So I kind of got the same feeling that, it seems that nothing really interesting is coming out of seminaries who are doing has been doing Islamic philosophy for such a long time. So this area is something that I think is really interesting to investigate more. And I think it was absent in our great conversations.
Would anyone like to address that? I mean, I obviously have thoughts on that because I've spoken to lots of Mamamin on precisely this kind of issue in different places. But anyone else would like to have a respond to Musa's question first? No?
I have another observation, but
sure,
not an answer to that question.
Shall I just quickly address that and then we can come to you, Milad?
Yes,
yeah?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what I was going to say is that, I mean, there are lots of things to unpack here. One is the way in which philosophy is taught in a place like Qom, and arguably in Najaf and the sort of satellite places like Beirut, etc., is not necessarily the same way in which this has been going on for 700 years. I think that's slightly misleading. Yes, it is very much about texts, and you could argue that in the old days, I mean, going back to the 12th or 13th century, people would have read an entire text, and then you would have got like an ijaza, like, a license, which means that they know the text and they can teach other people. The way in which texts are being studied and have been studied, I'd say since the Qajar period, is that increasingly there's a distinction being made between kind of beginners texts and more advanced texts. So a beginner will never be reading Avicenna or Mulla Sadra because the idea is that it's quite difficult. You need to have a bit of a grasp of some of the basic terminology, etc. So you start with easier texts. Now, in the 19th century, this was mainly the Manzume of Sabzavari, who died in 1873. And in the modern period, since the 1970s, it's been the Bidayat al-Hikmah and then the Nihayat al-Hikmah of Allama Tabatabai. And there are a few other texts. I mean, in Najaf, there is a beginning primer by the late Muhammad al-Mutaffar as well. There's a work which Abdul Jabbar Rifai has written. Rifai has a PhD in philosophy from Tehran University. And it seems like there was a bit of a gap. So in the 19th century, you have people who went and studied philosophy, and it tended to be a small group, and they were considered to be quite bright students. In the 20th century, as the number of people going to the seminaries has massively increased, so there's been, as we've seen in lots of academic institutions, a massive dumbing down. And that dumbing down basically means that they can't possibly read some of those more difficult texts without having to start with simple texts. And so like Bidayat al-Hikmah of Tabatabai has become like the entry point. Now, if you actually look at the Bidayah, I would argue Bidayah is not a very good text at all. And it reveals something of the the way in which Islamic philosophy, I think, has been instrumentalized in the modern period, precisely to deal with the sorts of encounter of modernity that Mohsen raised and Musa, you brought up. Insofar as they're not studying philosophy just in this traditional mode of, trying to understand reality as it is, but rather I think they're trying to do something else, which has been common since the 1950s at least, what in the Iranian context is called Kalam Jadid, in which philosophy and training in ideas around realism, and this is realism in the sense of what I guess nowadays we would call naive realism. So it's not Platonic realism, it's very much naive realism, which is at work, dealing with skeptical challenges. Is it possible to know anything? Is there anything outside of me? How do I know that it's me who's even thinking, etc.? Raising questions about, well, if metaphysics doesn't make sense, then how can you possibly talk about the ultimate metaphysical being, who is God? So a lot of the Kalam Jadid stress upon reading texts such as Bidayah was very much, I think, about engaging with that fundamental question of how do you make metaphysics possible? And of course, the aim of doing that, the goal of doing that is to argue for the existence of God. So if the reason why metaphysics has to be possible is because you have to be able to establish that God exists. And once God exists, the whole kind of system makes sense. So that's basically the point of the Bidayah and the Nihayat al-Hikmah. The punchline of the joke, so to speak, is God exists. And if people don't get that, then they're not doing it properly, right? That's the whole point of those two works. And it's not actually something that Tabatabai started. So there was a text which was written by one of his teachers, Mohsen Ghalavi Esfahani in Najaf. He wrote a work called Tuhfat al-Hakim, which is a poem. It's about 90 pages less on philosophy. It's been published with the commentary of Mehdi Hadi Yazdi. I think we mentioned Mehdi Hadi Yazdi once in passing, but I think Mehdi Hadi Yazdi is such a huge figure for the modern understanding of Islamic philosophy in Iran. Perhaps we'll come back to him. It's been published with the commentary of Mehdi Hadi Yazdi, and it's been edited by someone else who was mentioned, Sayyid Mustafa Muhammad Damad. Right? Now, if you look at that text, I think it gives you a sense of where that history of this kind of approach to philosophy, instrumentalization of philosophy comes from, right? And this is all along kind of understanding that fundamentally the way the Hawza works is that it's a completely ahistorical study of texts. If you asked your average person who's studying texts, whether it's in fiqh, whether it's usul al-fiqh, etc., if you even ask them who wrote this text, he will say like Sahib whoever, right? They won't even know the name of the author. If you ask them when was this written, they probably will not know that either. And this is as true of philosophical texts as of others. If you asked someone in the Hawza about Shamsuddin Khafri or Mansur Dashtaki, they might have a sense that they were before Mullah Sadra, but they wouldn't really be able to tell you when. They might not even know that actually. So the ahistorical element of it is true, as Musa mentioned. But I think the really important point is how philosophy is instrumentalized to become a tool that you can use to stand up to the sort of intellectual challenges of modernity. And alongside the metaphysical, epistemological challenges, which people are trained in through works like Bidayah and Nihaya, the other element of Kalam al-Jadid, which has been very important since the 60s as well, has been the philosophical intervention in the social sphere, right? And the best example of that, again, is the work of Allama Tabatabai, Usul al-Falsafa, which we talked about a few times. But even more than him, the works of his student, Murtada Mutahari, right? So Mutahari's extensive works, let's leave aside the question of the adequacy of the works, but Adl Ilahi, work on kind of the social sphere, the work on women's rights, the work on kind of introducing philosophy and mysticism and so forth. These works were extremely influential and important in making sense of why it is that philosophy has a social significance, and why particularly Islamic philosophy has a social significance which can be brought to bear. Now I can go on about this for ages and ages, so I'm going to stop because this is kind of my area. But that's just to kind of mention a couple of things which came to mind immediately. Did anyone want to comment on that, or shall we go to Milad? Musa, does that respond to your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
It's literally, just go and sit and, like, I've done that a couple of times back in the days when Javadi Amali was teaching the Asfar in the Masjid al-Azam. You just go and sit there and you get a sense of what it's like. I mean, that was good because he knew his stuff. So his classes on the Asfar were probably the best that you will get. But of course, it also depends on how we do things. I mean, some people learn from that. Some people prefer reading books. Personally, I prefer reading books. So I think a lot of people just went and hang out in Alay Javadi's class just because it was like the thing to do. In the same way that people go and study Irfan with Hassan Zadeh Amali because that's what it does. Despite the fact that he was very old, and he has been old for a long time, and you're not really going to get much out of those classes, but that's the way it works. And then of course I think with the next generation of teachers, the Fayyazis, etc., you get I think a much better sense of why this is politically and socially relevant. Okay, shall we go to Milad now?
Sure. I mean, this is a comment and an observation. I really appreciate that you and Mohsen had this series. And I think we learned quite a bit through various interventions, particularly those who spoke from Iran about sort of conditions of philosophy and thinking. And oftentimes, I think what I learned was a lot of it was between the lines as well, of just trying to describe the social context of the work that is being done, as opposed to XY philosophy. It seemed to me that, let's say, philosophy of science, ethics meant something very different in Iran than it means that they would mean within a philosophical department, with a philosophy department somewhere here. And I also appreciate that you thematize the kind of political context and social context of it. And Mohsen correctly points out that this goes before the revolution. But also, all of this to me makes philosophy quite contentious in Iran. And it is very difficult to speak about XY philosophy without already collapsing into a reified social political position. So Motahari is a great example of this. Or Allame is even a great example. When he addresses questions of idealism and materialism, that is already a response to a social context dominated by some vulgar Marxist ideas of idealism and materialism. And of course, Motahari picks up on this. So even one of the most, in my opinion, learned philosophers of the modern period, when they produce a work that then becomes paradigmatic, stands for something much broader, is already within the social field of Iranian modernity, would emerge is a political social position as well. And I think that is important to acknowledge, and then acknowledge that everybody who gets to then speak about philosophy in Iran has to think about this situation. And most of us, most of your guests, also come from various, they're embedded in institutions of knowledge production in Iran, or they are, few of us have been outside of Iran, but we also project onto Iran our own sort of order of what is philosophy, what you know, that there is political theology, that there is aesthetics, that there is critical theory. So there must be something of equivalent of these things that's being translated to Iran. So I think in future I would be quite interested if we also had some of these other knowledge producers in Iran that comprise this much larger field of philosophy, thinking, but also social political contention. So rather than just acknowledging that it exists, but also bringing that into the fore to precisely make explicit what you just described, that Islamic philosophy is also instrumentalized. And in order to think about tradition Islam philosophy in a way that is not instrumentalized, we have to also have some kind of an ijtihad on the field of instrumentalization in order to think something outside of it, something to think about, you know, to maybe find a philosophical, theoretical, critical way out of this instrumentalization of philosophy, the fact that it sort of collapses into social political activism, or if it doesn't, or if maybe there's no way out, and this is precisely the conditions of modernity. But that seems to be the task, insofar as we keep on gesturing towards philosophy as almost a scholastic practice, but in reality, we're talking about political and social contentions. But I'll stop. Sorry for the long comment.
No, actually, I think that's kind of spot on. I was going to just bring up two anecdotes which might kind of illustrate your points quite well. The first one goes back to the first time I was in Iran back in the winter of '95, and I was at a Shab-e Yalda party. And Tehran was a bit different in those days, but you still had Shab-e Yalda parties. And someone asked me what I was doing, and I said, oh, I do work on Islamic philosophy. And that led to this rant, as you can imagine, about politics and about hating Islam. And I was like, I didn't even know what I said. What did I say? You know, I thought it was a perfectly innocent description of what I do. And that was when I first realized that Islamic philosophy has, as a phrase, has such a lot of baggage in Iran. The second anecdote, and Mohsen will remember this, was 2 years ago when I was in Iran, and I gave a talk in a conference which, I mean, it was a strange conference. Most conferences in philosophy in Iran are strange, let's be honest. I thought I gave a fairly straightforward paper, but it was somewhat critical. And then I had a couple of, you know, older people kind of putting me in my place. It seems that in certain contexts, I mean, I'm not exactly that young anymore, but it seems in certain contexts that if you're an outsider, and if you're not white, and if you're not sufficiently deferential, then you get put in your place. And of course, I wasn't going to put up with it, so I basically told them where to go, which probably didn't help much either. But that happens a lot, and I've seen that with other people as well. You know, quibbling over silly things unnecessarily. You know, questioning your credentials. It's happened in so many contexts. So that's, and I can imagine if I were a woman in this, it would be a hell of a lot worse, right? I'd probably be condescended to, you know, 10 times worse than what happened there.
If you ever got invited in the first place.
Exactly, yeah. If you ever got invited as well. So I think, I mean, obviously, sometimes we forget, in lots of contexts, philosophy is contentious, right? And sometimes it's contentious because of its absence, right? So, you know, people don't take philosophy seriously, or you have a kind of anti-intellectual bent in a particular society. You know, and that happens as well. I think in many cases, philosophy is contentious because it's kind of striking at basic fundamental issues. You know, how do you understand the world? How are you capturing that world? How are you describing that world? And especially in a context and contexts which are ideologically charged, these are fundamental issues of division and contention. So it's not surprising that philosophy would be contentious precisely for those reasons.
I just want to add another observation which might be related to Milad. I mean, I talked about the results of globalization of philosophy. I meant that I think there is a growing interest in doing philosophy or doing philosophy as a profession in a global sense. I think this might be this might have influence on the way the philosophy is done, and in this way the philosophy somehow is decontextualized. Those who are trying to work internationally, they try to publish in journals, and they try to contribute to the global problems of philosophy, for example, epistemology, or even in Islamic philosophy, the works which are published in languages other than Arabic and Persian, for example, in English, are not have not many social and political context. You cannot see the social political context in those works. I think if this stream increases or increases in the context of Iran, maybe the philosophy will not be that contentious in the context of Iran.
But you know,
It's
even
kind of an institutionalization of philosophy or professionalization of philosophy.
Yeah, which is, and that was one of the things that Sayyid Nasir was talking about. But one of my concerns is that professionalization is also a way in which you replicate certain types of hierarchies, and you set up, you know, hoops through which people have to jump through to be recognized. You know, so it's also a way of like, you know, saying, okay, this is philosophy, this is not philosophy, and I actually think in terms of the global field, let's just park very traditional Anglo-American analytic philosophy on the side for a second. But what I find exciting in academic philosophy now is the move towards global philosophy. And that's precisely asking the sort of questions about how do you do philosophy? Do you have to write it? What about orality? You know, what constitutes philosophy? Are we, you know, what are we doing to decolonize the way in which knowledge is produced, right? Especially with respect to philosophy. And one of the elements of saying, well, in Iran, philosophy is young, it needs to be professionalized, in effect, I think could lead to a situation where you're saying all that stuff is nonsense, right? It doesn't need to be decolonized. You know, the kind of really shocking practice where you suddenly realize that people doing philosophy of religion in Iran are just, you know, the plantagia, or something like that. I mean, that's plantingia. It's like, it's shocking to me because plantinga is so irrelevant to any non-Protestant context that I can't imagine why anyone would even embrace that. So it's bizarre to me. You're basically replicating, you know, forms of dominance and hierarchy which exist elsewhere, and that makes no sense. And so, if you're really going to be part of this wider global context, then you think about, well, what does philosophy mean globally? You know, can we come up with an idea about how you do philosophy, which works in different contexts? Can we think about different ways of doing philosophy? Can we, you know, is the problem just the word philosophy? You know, can we think beyond that? And then how do we change the practice in both philosophy departments and outside of that department? Now, I can say that quite easily because I'm not a philosopher. I have no stake in dismantling the discipline, right? I'm perfectly happy dismantling the discipline because I'm a historian. But I know a lot of people would be very resistant to those sorts of changes because they're invested in the way in which they see their particular discipline.
Can I say something about this? Even the language that we are using to describe is quite interesting. So Mohsen is talking about globalization, and Sajjad, you're talking about decolonization of knowledge. And the word globalization in Iran means something specific, right? It means that it would help growth of philosophy in Iran by putting it into conversation with already established, reified, let's say, philosophical discourses. And in this case, they're mostly European. So whereas decolonization is where, in the aftermath of post-Orientalist critique and recognitions of a specificity of even like doing philosophy in the West, has emerged a need to think about how is philosophy done elsewhere. So I guess my worry, also being situated, let's say in this moment here, not in Iran, is to what the limit of what you're describing as globalization in helping us understand, specifically, to be very explicit also, the way that within the institutions of the secular academy, within the secular transformations that have made possible comparative philosophy through development, as you pointed out, there's a Christian Protestant history and all of this, to now then engage Islamic philosophy, to engage with a tradition of philosophy that is based in the seminaries. To what extent this actually enables a conversation, and to what extent it exacerbates a rift that already exists in Iran between an Islamic way of doing philosophy and a modern secular way that has emerged, as you pointed out, as part of the modern transformation, as part of the debates about modernity, as part of the debates of establishing secular institutions of national education, so universities in Iran. And of course, it is all of this that comes to this rift is what comes to an head in the revolution, in the cultural revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini also says, well, we can't do philosophy in this way that is not socially and politically relevant. We have to produce an Islamic philosophy that answers questions of society, and universities and seminaries have to be brought together as part of this project. So to me, the question of globalization doesn't really allow us inclusion of Iranian thinking in secular paradigms of education and philosophy does not allow us to think about the constitutive rift of philosophy in Iran today. That to me seems quite specific. Of course, this does not mean it's not important to help developed institutions of philosophy and these dialogues. I think it's quite important that for Iranian thinkers to be able to publish in international journals in English, to receive reviews that would allow them to develop their thinking. And all of this is important, but it does not address the more fundamental questions of how to bring a dialogue that is not really in the guise of a global, but really a secular Western paradigm, than to actually really think the global from multiple angles.
I think that's very much true. I have one follow-up on that, but let me go back and open it. I think Attar had a point or a question, comment.
Hi, could you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really regret that I missed so many great conversations here. So if I apologize in advance if my question, comment has been covered already. So I wanted, I mean, it's a kind of relevant to the previous question and actually your last comment, I mean, Sajjad's last comment about the relationship between historians and philosophers. Especially, I mean, I am personally a philosopher by training. I did philosophy of science in Iran, and then I switched to history, basically history of science. But I wanted to ask why philosophy is kind of, and it is a study of philosophy. Philosophy as a field is kind of absent in the intellectual histories. I mean, intellectual history as a genre, especially in the Western intellectual histories that have been written actually by kind of political scientists like Mehrzad Burujerdi, or sociologists like Ali Mir Sepasi, or like or other intellectual historians. For example, I recently read a great book written by Professor, I mean, Afshin Matin Askari. It's a very important work. Its name is Neither Western Nor Eastern. So it's a kind of a very ironical reference to. I mean, the name is both Western and Eastern, and actually, when you read through that book, I mean, from the first chapters towards the end, you can feel that he kind of is reluctant to address the issue of philosophy or any to refer to any philosopher in a kind of in conversation with the intellectual history of Iran. So he kind of it was really surprising to me that intellectual history kind of go around philosophy, not address it as a sort of a serious field of study in Iran. And basically, my guess here, if it's true, I mean, I'm really curious to know your opinion about this kind of dissonance between history and philosophy in this question. But my guess is that it's because of the political and intellectual importance of philosophy in current Iran or in history of Iran, and it actually goes back to previous question. I mean, Milad has kind of very interestingly elaborated that question. So it was my question. I mean, the importance of history in importance of philosophy in intellectual histories. I'm sorry if it gets long.
I mean, I would say my reading is somewhat different. I mean, Ali Mir Sepasi's book on Fardid does talk about philosophy, but it's a very particular tradition, and even then, I mean, arguably, that's not necessarily the book to go to if you want to understand Heidegger in Iran. I mean, that book really hasn't been written yet. I think someone else, I mean, I'll say this because he's a friend, but I think Iskandar Sadeghi's book on Revolution and its Discontents is much more explicit about the philosophical significance of some of these things. So he brings in Habermas, he brings in all sorts of people, you know, all the time into the book, and it is of relevance. So he gives you, you know, the context which we talked about the other day about how the reformists were coming out and were you know, writing in the late 90s in the context in which philosophy of science was emerging, were writing in a context in which the sort of questions around philosophy of religion were being discussed. So I think Iskandar's book does that well. But yeah, I think, you know, there hasn't been a book which problematizes philosophy as such in Iran. There are lots of works which kind of touch upon it. So even, you know, the earlier work on the development of scientific learning in Iran does that. Even Ali Reza Doustaz's book on the occult in Iran, you know, engages with this category of philosophy and not philosophy or reason and irrationality or whatever. So it's there in lots of different studies. But I think you're right. Yes, there isn't a singular work which is focused on the development of philosophy or the debates about philosophy as such. I mean, I don't know if anyone's familiar with anything which does.
Actually, I have to say, I mean, one of the criticisms of Afshin Matinaskeri about the history of intellectual histories of Iran, I mean, history of, I mean, the past few years focus on intellectual history, is that most of these intellectual histories has been written by non-historians. So many like misunderstandings or many I don't know, methodological errors comes from this kind of lack of training in intellectual, lack of, not training, kind of, lack of historical view in studying intellectual history of Iran. So, and he claims that he's kind of he has written the first, sort of first, I mean, beside Muhammad Tawakkoli Tarqi's historiography about, I mean, the refashioning of Iran. So it's a kind of legitimate question that asks why historians did not, have not kind of liked to study intellectual history. So and actually he mentions so many of the previous books in intellectual history that are written by non-historians. Yeah, that's I mean, you mentioned Ali Reza Doustar, or I really don't know Iskandar Sadeghi, but I don't know, I mean, his background and his previous, I mean, his kind of intellectual training. But I don't know if you think this criticism critic is kind of valid and relevant here or not. I mean, do you agree with Afshin Matinaskeri?
I actually just got the book recently. I haven't read it yet. I have read one review which pointed out the absence of any women in the book. And that was quite an interesting review, which basically said that it's as if the intellectual history of modern Iran is completely male. And perhaps that's, again, another way in which these things get projected. But I haven't actually read it yet, to be honest. But I know Iskandar is an old friend, and he's someone who comes from a philosophy background, and he now teaches in political theory. So it's a bit different. He's not really a historian as such. But I mean, if you're asking me whether Ali Mirsapasi's work is adequate, then I would say it's not adequate at all, as far as I can. I find it deeply problematic at so many different levels. But there's not that much out there, and I think that's maybe one of the issues. There are lots of historians who work in Iran, and certainly in the older generations, there was this kind of thing about why would you waste your time? I remember one very prominent older Iranian historian based in the States warning me when I was a grad student, why would you study philosophy? You're not going to get a job. You know, no one's interested in this stuff. You know, work on the basics. You know, do the stuff that people are interested. Do the socioeconomic, political stuff. That's what people really care about. And that might be a constraint of the field. But I see that shifting when you have people who are anthropologists like Ali Reza, like Milad, you leaning on this, and I think that intervention is very important. There'll be many others who will be doing it. I don't stay very close to Iranian studies for lots of reasons, but I think other colleagues could say something about that. Maybe someone who's based in Iran has something to say about this, about the kind of eclipsing of philosophy from the kind of modern Iranian intellectual history. Does anyone want to, who's Iran based, would like to say something about that? Mila, do you have something to say?
Well, I was going to say, like, Murad Farhadpour, the translator of critical theory, has also original writing of himself, and he writes about philosophy in Iran and relationship of philosophy and translation. Another person who would give you another take of very, very different take, but also parallel to be read with and also against kind of writings on Fardid and modernity is Javad Tabatabaei's writing, and which is already a kind of a translation. And I say this because Sajjad was asking about various philosophical discourses that we did not discuss as part of the series, but Tabatabai, to my understanding, is the first Iranian to receive a PhD from a European university writing on a European philosopher. So I think he is the first to graduate from Sorbonne and he defended his PhD on Hegel. And his early works, he was a student of Althusser and others, his early works are translations, but then he entirely moves away from that project, and his writing on Iranian intellectual history, Tajaddud, modernity, is quite interesting, and is a reflection on the relationship between tradition, also Islamic tradition of law, of philosophy, kalam, and forms of thought that emerged in Iran from 19th century onwards through translation. I think those are where I would also look. So, and also the writings on Fardid, there are a few books on Fardid in Farsi, and that would be an interesting counterpoint to Mir Sepahsi's writing. And they have a very different political and intellectual agenda.
I mean, I think that's very important, because one of the things which I still find so shocking is how many people who read and work in this field, and by that field now I'm talking about intellectual history, but do not really engage with sources which are in Persian. I mean, I find that astonishing. And the same thing with people who work with intellectual history of Arab context, and just don't bother engaging with people writing in Arabic. One academic friend said, "Yeah, but we don't have time. It's difficult enough reading a primary text in Arabic. You want me to read a secondary text as well?" And I'm like, that's just a really bad excuse. That's a really, really bad excuse. So it's, and I think I see this all the time. I get so many, we get, PhD applications coming in all the time. And if someone say, for example, contemporary thought in, I don't know, Pakistan, let's say, right? And not one word of bibliography listed is in Urdu. And I'm like thinking, what the hell's going on? I mean, why is that completely eclipsed? Only if significant is in English? And I fear that sometimes happens in quite a lot, that people just kind of ignore that whole area of scholarship. At the same time, I mean, it would be nice to see it on in English on Iranian intellectual history, which is anything like, for example, Yoav de Caprio's history of existentialism in the Arab context. I mean, that's a wonderful book. There's nothing like that. Or Fadi Badawi's book on the new Lebanese left. in the 60s and 70s. I mean, these are serious engagements with philosophy, engaged with those texts, with those works, with those contexts in those areas, in Egypt and Lebanon in particular. And I just find it astonishing that no one's really done that in an Iranian context. There are very similar kinds of things happening. The reception of Heidegger, which is one thing that DiCaprio talks about a lot, is very similar to what's happening in Iran in a much earlier period as well. Mohsen, do you want to any other kind of?
I just wanted to add another point about Milad's first observation. It is about university-based institutions. I mean, to be honest, so far, we talked about the sides of philosophy in Iran, which are important and influential in the social and political context. But there's a dark side, which is also irrelevant to the social and political context. As an example, to mention just an example, especially in the universities, that there is a burgeoning number of the so-called ilmi pajouheshi journals or articles, many of which has no relevance except that it helps the scholars to be promoted. I mean, many scholars of philosophy are occupied with publishing these kinds of stuff to get promoted in the universities, and these kinds of works has nothing to do with any social and political context. I think we should take this fact also into consideration.
Very much so. And then the problem is when you start writing outside of that context, you get accused of being an activist. And yes, promotions are important. 90% of the stuff that we publish to get promoted, frankly, I would say is nonsense, which will never survive. But that's what happens, especially in European contexts in which the pressure on publication is much greater, actually, I would say, than it is in North America. Although people for American and Canadian friends are always kind of shocked when I say that, but it's true. The pressure that we have or colleagues have in France is much greater to publish than you'd ever face, even at a major research university in North America.
I would count all of those as part of the socio-political context, but I understand that you mean that it's not responding to the rift that I was talking about. But it's very much
I know that.
Yeah, symptom of the institutional, economical, needs for this. Yeah.
I just wanted to raise one thing, which I mean, it comes back to my conception of what global philosophy is. And it came out of a conversation in another set of seminars, which I'm running with a colleague in Pakistan. We had a very interesting conversation with Shankar Nair, who's written a wonderful book on 17th century a Mughal context of interaction between Persian speaking Persianate intellectuals and Sanskrit intellectuals. And the sorts of encounters that you had there, for example, either translating ideas from the yoga tradition into Persian, connecting it or linking it, comparing it with trends within Sufism or within Ishraqi philosophy. That sort of comparative or even global conception of philosophy is something which is very much part of this Persianate tradition and yet seems to have been entirely forgotten. Apart from the work that, Fatullah Mujtabai did so many years ago, or Dariush Shairan, it seems to me quite strange that there is very little interest in this kind of engagement with philosophy looking east, right? Now, recently I came across a book on the Kyoto school. Who was it again? It's someone who's written on, I think, Heidegger.
Asghari.
Yeah. So
Muhammad Asghari.
I thought that was really interesting because, and actually I can see how, you could write a really interesting comparison between, say, the Faradid circle or the earlier encounter with Heidegger and the Kyoto circle, Kyoto school, because it's the same kind of thing about how do we make our philosophical traditions relevant and how do we engage with what they consider to be the cutting edge, and the cutting edge was coming out of Germany, right? Now there's some wonderful studies on the Kyoto circle, but there aren't the same ones which link it in with what's going on here. And then of course you have the reception of Husserl and Heidegger and phenomenology in India. The best example of this is someone like Jitendra Mohanty. Mohanty was a student of, I think he was a student of Husserl. I can't remember who it was, someone very famous whose name I can't remember now. This is happening in a lot of contexts which are not Western. And what they're doing is that they're then rereading their own philosophical traditions in a very sophisticated way. So it's not just about adopting Heidegger. It's not just about adopting Husserl, but it's saying, what is the relevance of this? How does that help us to understand and read this particular kind of text? And I don't know much about whether in Iran there is any appetite for these other philosophical traditions looking east, whether it's in Chinese philosophy, whether it's Japanese, whether it's in India, African philosophy. I don't know. You tell me.
As far as I know, there is little interest in those kinds of works. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because of the Eurocentrism in philosophy in Iran, if it is a good term for this. But yeah, I think when I was a student in University of Tehran, there was just one or two professors who were working on Indian thought or Eastern thought. I think Mohammad Reza Rikhdegaran was the professor in the University of Tehran who is working in Eastern thoughts, but there is a little interest in this kind of stuff. There is a growing interest in working on and studying comparative philosophy, and because many of some of what has been done in comparative philosophy is published by Chinese, or maybe mostly Chinese, or some other Eastern philosophers or thinkers. Those kinds of works are being read to some extent, but no, it is not about the work on Indian thought or on Chinese thought or other Eastern traditions.
Can I add a quick point?
Yes. Go ahead.
One of the funniest, actually, some of the funniest caricatures of philosophy that I've seen coming out of academia in Iran are the works in comparative philosophy, which is basically, okay, Heidegger and Mullah Sadra, and why Heidegger was wrong and Mullah Sadra was right. Or basically like getting two concepts that's been used by two philosophers in like vastly different backgrounds and contexts. And that's just showing that, how we are better. Like Al-Ghazali came to the problem of causality way before Hume, and so on and so forth. I want to actually add two very quick comments. One of them is another actually area that we think we missed, which is very important, like at least in the educational part of teaching philosophy in Iran, is history of philosophy. Like philosophy in Iran, the way it is taught is history of philosophy. Now that I'm like talking from a kind of analytic point of view, I'm not a big fan of this way of teaching philosophy. Not saying that, you know, I don't think history of philosophy is not important. It is hugely important, but at least it's not the best pedagogical way to work with philosophy. And another, actually, probably again more sociological observation is, I was always like, it's very interesting that how actually in Iran, sometimes like one person can cause some huge changes in the way that philosophy has been taught and, you know, research in Iran. For instance, I remember, I think that everyone agrees with me that, you know, the history of medieval philosophy in Iran can be divided to before Ilkhani and after Ilkhani. Like this one person came to Louvain and, you know, did a great job in learning about medieval philosophy, went back to Iran and started to publish and good books and, you know, have great students. And suddenly like a huge change actually came out of that, like good books on Boethius and, you know, history of medieval philosophy, and even like Saint Bonaventura, like these like people that even at Notre Dame, they are kind of obscure philosophers. Interesting books has been published. Or, you know, the things that probably Dr. Vahid has done in analytic philosophy, that, you know, one person could actually brought so much change. But then there is the, I mean, it's a double-bladed sword, because then, you know, one person can also cause a lot of damage to philosophy. In this regard, I do not need to probably mention any name.
Yeah, Rami and Jahan Beglu, yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, certainly on the study of India, you know, Dariush Ayran's work is still, you know, by far the most significant. And, you know, even with, as an introduction to Indian philosophies, his 2 volumes on the 6 traditional schools is actually a pretty good introduction. I'm wondering if Zahra wants to say something. I'd like to hear from her.
Yes, thank you so much. I joined you late, but I could listen to your great ideas, and it was a great discussion. Thank you so much. I wanted just to add 2 examples of new studies in comparative philosophy, which these 2 studies are not like the other comparative studies in philosophy. I think they are good examples of a real philosophical study, of a real dialogue between philosophers. One of them is a work that has not been, didn't have a good reception in Iran, unfortunately, because of its very, it is very specialized in metaphysics, and so it doesn't have many general audience in Iran. The name is How Metaphysics is Possible, written with Dr. Qavam Safari, which is a real dialogue between the most important metaphysicians in the history of philosophy, from Plato to Aristotle to Kant. And then there's a dialogue between these so-called Western philosophers, and between Avicenna, between Mullah Sadra and Allama Tabatabai, which is a real great study and profound study in comparative metaphysics. And the other work is written by Dr. Talebzadeh, which its title is A Dialogue Among Hegel and Muslim Philosophers. This is also a profound work, but the problem with this work is that it is untranslatable, because the language and terminology of the work is very hard, is very difficult, and it has some kind of ancient Arabic language. But I think if some words can be translated into English or German, they can be regarded as great examples of an Iranian contribution to modern philosophy, to modern subjects of philosophy. I know that there are very rare examples of such studies, but I think that these two books should be considered as good, yeah, some good examples of a profound, serious, and modern contributions to philosophy from an Iranian point of view.
Thank you. That's really useful. Although your mention of the work on Hegel reminds me of a conversation I had a long time ago with Feyzbakhsh Wahdat. And Feyzbakhsh was saying to me, you know, if you really want to understand modern Iranian history, you need to read Hegel. Because Hegel explains Iran better than anyone else. And I thought it was a strange comment then. I still think it's a bit of a strange comment. But I have since then come across so many Iranians who are obsessed with Hegel that maybe I think he had a point there. Anyway, that's kind of a slightly flippant comment. But, thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, I'd also, I mean, we asked you when we had that conversation with you about your training and so forth. I mean, can you say maybe a bit more about like how you yourself teach philosophy? I think. Is she still there?
I think she is there.
Yeah, but it's the pitch is frozen. Oh, yeah, it looks like it's frozen. Okay. Oh yeah, Zahra, can you hear us?
Sajjad, sorry, I was disconnected. Would you please repeat your question?
I was going to say, if you could, obviously we discussed lots of things when we were talking the other day, but could you say something a bit more about how you teach philosophy and what sort of resources you do and what the setting is? I mean, what sort of students do you have?
Yes, and one important point that I can mention as regard to your question is that unfortunately in Iran, studying philosophy is not based on reading the original text of philosophers, and it's very, very bad because the students do not have enough courage to encounter, to cope with the real philosophical text. And I think for the first time I started teaching philosophy basically according to real philosophical texts. And I remember that many other professors disagreed and they really condemned me for that because they think that philosophical texts are sacred texts, and the students who are very young and who don't have any information about philosophy should not encounter and face with philosophical texts. They should just listen to the professors' lectures and after some years they are allowed to read philosophical texts themselves personally. And I think it's very bad, this atmosphere. But when I tried to teach the students to how to read philosophical texts, and I made many supplementary texts about how to read philosophical texts, how to write philosophical texts, how to analyze a philosophical text, how to take the arguments of a philosopher in a text. I saw that the students were very successful, and they could get deep into the text, and they could discover many new things that even our professors who had a long history in reading philosophical text, they couldn't discover those points in that text, in those texts. It was a successful experience for me and for the students, and still the students are admiring that experience because, for example, a student who is in his or her first class of philosophy can read, for example, Kant's Metaphysics of Morals and can discover what Kant wants to say about what is the basis of morality. And it's very exciting for the students to be able to observe a philosophical text and to get the arguments from the text. But unfortunately, many little philosophy professors are doing so, and I think only very few professors teach Islamic philosophical texts, which is not very exciting. The method of teaching philosophy in classes is not very exciting for the students. And the students should do a lot of endeavor to understand how to get deep into the text, because they didn't have any experience. They are not taught, they haven't learned about how to cope with the text, how to analyze the text. And if the method is changed, if the method can be changed, and the professors use original text to teach philosophy, I think that our students would be more courage to 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 discover what philosophy is, and maybe they will be able to create and produce something new. I think that one of the most important problems with philosophy in Iran is that our students, researchers, and professors do not have enough courage to create something new in philosophy, because they think that, as you mentioned earlier, philosophy in Iran is very young, is something new, is a new discipline, and most parts of the philosophical literature in Iran is from translations, and very little has been produced by the Iranian thinkers. So I think that the Iranian philosophers do not have enough courage to create something new, something from their own culture, and to explain their views, their philosophical views, in a language which is from its own culture, from its own view. And I think one reason for this is that they haven't encountered with the philosophical text from the early days of learning philosophy. Sorry, I talked a lot.
No, actually,
Oh, I'm disconnected again.
I think we missed Sajjad.
Yeah, we missed that.
Yeah, we missed Sajjad. I think that I was disconnected, but Sajjad is disconnected.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your point. It was very interesting. Yeah, I had the same experience as well, and you're completely right. I think we have talked about this kind of teaching philosophy in Iran in one other session. I think we talked about it with Said Musavian. It's awful. Yeah, Sajjad is back.
And I'm sorry for interrupting. Could you please explain more on the reasons why?
sorry, my connection went. Oh,
Yeah, the reasons why these kinds of awful ways of teaching has been kind of established in Iran. I'm really curious to know the genesis, the origins of this sort of the tradition of teaching. If it's not, irrelevant to our discussion.
Atta, if I want to give an answer, I should say that I don't know. why, I don't know the roots of or the origin of this kind of teaching philosophy, but um, um, one apparent phenomenon that I could see in philosophy professors in Iran is that they regard philosophical text as sacred texts. Really, I really mean that. And they say this obviously. And because of this, they think that everyone, it is not for everyone. It is not that everyone is allowed to get close to a philosophical text. And I think it has some historical roots in Iranian culture, and more importantly in our mystical culture, because as you know, many mystics and many Sufis didn't want to explain their views very obviously in clear words, and they tried to cover their meanings under a cover of a difficult terminology. And I think that's maybe one route for this sacrificing or regarding philosophy as something sacred. Maybe is one route is this historical view about philosophy and mysticism in the Iranian culture. This is this is my personal experience and observation when I was encountering with philosophy professors. But there are also many other reasons that maybe Mohsen is able to explain some of them.
Yeah, I just wondering if another reason may be the language barrier. I mean, there is only recently that many of or many of philosophical books, philosophical primary texts are being translated. But in the beginning of the establishment of philosophy departments, there was little or even almost no primary text translated into Persian. And then and because of the language barrier, because the students weren't able to read English or in any other languages, the professors was to teach on themselves without text, and then it became a tradition. I don't know if it is historically correct, but it might be an explanation.
Yes, I agree, Mohsen. And I wonder if this is not the method in Hose, is it? I think they use original text for discussions, and they have discussions also, while in Iran there is no discussion class in philosophy. And many times if students ask many questions, the professor will get angry because they think that the students are not allowed to ask many questions about philosophy. It's not general, but in some classes and in the view of some professors, discussing in philosophy is not very good for the students. But I think that it is not the same in seminary, is it? If you have any experience.
I don't have any experience, but I think in terms of discussions, you're right. I think it is maybe it is better in houses. But in terms of reading primary text, if you, let's say, hadith collections are primary texts, or even primary texts in philosophy or theology, they are also hardly read in the houses now. In the houses, always secondary texts are taught and are read, and it is exacerbated during these decades, these recent decades, I think. If you have any other reflections, Sajjad.
Yeah, I mean, well, one good example is if you take Bidayatul Hikmah. I mean, my impression is a lot of students read the translation and the commentary of Ali Shirwani or something like that. And a lot of students, to be perfectly honest, cannot read the Arabic properly. I mean, apart from the fact that the Arabic of the Bidayat al-Hikmah is really bad. I mean, it's very, very bad Arabic. But they can't. I've actually, I remember once I was sitting in the Haram in Qom, and there were 2 or 3 students who were clearly repeating their class next to me. And I was just sitting kind of quite near actually the grave of Allame. And they were kind of going through these and they were reading the Arabic completely incorrectly. And I really kind of felt like I should jump in and say, look, that's not Arabic. That's not what it says. But I kind of held myself back because, you know, I'm not Mu'ammam and all that. But I think the other point to remember is that, you know, even in Dars-e-Kharij, there is this kind of myth about how people ask questions, and, you know, the Maraja encourage questions because it shows them who their intelligent students are. In practice, this is not true, right? This has not been true for a very long time. You know, we have these very famous stories about like Ayatollah Khomeini teaching in Najaf, where he would get very angry if people ask questions. And I've seen Maraja getting angry. So I about 10 years or so ago, I was in Najaf, and I was with a friend. We were sitting in the Dars-e-Kharij of Sheikh Bashir Najafi. And someone would ask a question and he'd get really angry. And he'd say stuff like, that was a really stupid question. What are you doing in this class? Stuff like that. No, you see, I mean, for me, that's not what someone teaching in the Hawza should be doing. And I think it is true that in many cases, especially the older generation of the teachers of Dars-e-Kharij are not very accepting of questions. The younger ones are. So, and the ones who want to kind of show that they are open and interesting. So if you take someone like, who I know a lot of people respect, he teaches in Arabic, Haydar Hubballah, Lebanese in Qom. And he's known as someone who really does encourage questions and answers. So he really does run of his as if they're excellent. But that's relatively rare. That's relatively rare. Of course, you know, I mean, one of the interesting questions I'll have when we do our conversations on Turkey is whether there's the same kind of obsession with tradition and with these, you know, qualifier Islamic. One thing I do know, last time I gave a lecture in Istanbul, and I was sitting with the head of the department, the head of the Islamic philosophy department at Istanbul. So all the people coming into the office were referring to him and to me as Hoja, right? So you know what Hoja in Turkish is kind of like, it's like Ustad, but it's more than Ustad. It's like Murshid. It's like it's how you refer to a Sufi, like Pir as well. So you know, Hoja. And I was in the back of that.
We missed.
It's really
the
bad.
Murshid is gone. The Murshid is gone.
Okay, I mean, we could easily go on for ages and ages, but I'm just kind of aware of time. I just want to say again, you know, thank you for everyone for their contributions. And it's been good fun. And as Milad said, you know, we've only just scratched the surface. There's probably so much more we could have said and done about philosophy in Iran and in lots of different contexts. I hope some of you will also join us for our conversations on Turkey. I'll keep you posted when those start. And please do stay in touch. You know, as I mentioned a while ago, for me, this is not just kind of random interest. I am actually trying to develop a research project on sort of the reception and the transformation of European philosophy within certain contexts in across the Middle East and across the Muslim world. And I have 3 case studies I'm looking at the moment. One is Iran, one is Pakistan, and the third one is Morocco. So for me, this has been very useful just to kind of get a sense of some of the landscape of what's in Iran. And I certainly hope to to be able to travel to Iran when it will be possible, so that I can hopefully meet some of you and certainly look more into this question. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohsen. It was very interesting.
I had a question. I mean, a kind of. Is there any other way other than Twitter for informing or broadcasting your kind of, announcements and these things? Because Twitter is kind of is a little bit. I mean, the atmosphere is a little bit tense, and sometimes some people like me think to go, to leave Twitter for a while and then go back. I mean, it's a kind of, is there any email list, for example?
So we developed an email list of people who were involved in these Zoom. So I have all of those emails, and as I said, for the Turkey ones, I'll send those emails to everyone on that list. So I can add you to that. If you either let Mohsen or myself, if you give us your email address, we can add you to that. In terms of announcing, because this was supposed to be, I'm actually going to stop recording because this is not relevant to the recording.